Welcome to GONKCAST, a long-form discussion podcast about the music of English electronic duo Autechre, album by album, EP by EP. I'm Gabe.
I'm Dan.
And this is a bonus episode on a subscriber-chosen topic, Seefeel's new album, seriously new, it came out just May 1st, 2026, called Sol.Hz.
And if you're listening to the free preview right now and want to hear the whole thing, head on over to patreon.com/GONKCAST, where $5 a month gets you access to every one of our bi-weekly bonus episodes on Autechre adjacent music, plus the opportunity to vote on the album we'll cover next.
Yeah, and I forgot to mention, I think last episode I had said that we wanted to try to give kind of a longer preview, at least so that listeners could hear for free, like the generalities discussion before we get into the individual tracks. Patreon's giving me a hard time, but we are putting that up on YouTube. So if you go over to our YouTube, search GONKCAST, you'll find really kind of the first half or first third of these bonus episodes. So if you're interested, check it out. Also, don't forget that our next main episode will be the next in our series, revisiting Autechre's 2016 LP, LSEC, this time on LSEC 3. So revisit LSEC 3 for yourself. Tell us your thoughts. GONKCASTpod@gmail.com. Dan, should we get into the episode?
Let's do it. A little bit of background. Seefeel are a UK electronic band currently composed by producer Mark Clifford, vocalist Sarah Peacock, and bassist Darren Seymour. They first formed back in the early 90s, bonding over their shared love of the Cocktail Twins. Seefeel later collaborated with Cocktail Twins on the excellent Otherness remix EP. And Seefeel were famously the first guitar band signed to Warp Records in 1994. Sol.Hz, which dropped on May 1st of this year, is their fifth LP and first since 2011, not counting their two mini albums from 2024. Mark Clifford has described it as their least focused album. Normally there's a principle behind each record, he told The Wire magazine in this month's cover story. This album feels more like a strange compilation to me of the last 4 or 5 years. Clifford is known for working very slowly and for being a slightly insane perfectionist. He'll apparently tinker with a track in post until it becomes an entirely different track, which has resulted in as many as 110 evolutions of a single idea. Clifford has also pitched Sol.Hz as Seefeel's first proper dub album, which is strange because dub has always been a core part of their sound. However, Clifford also had this to say about the bass on this record. It's using much shorter, sharper notes rather than heavy, long ones. It's not languid like dub music, and the bass is working against the rhythm, punctuating it more.
Another impression you get from that Wire cover story is that this is a somewhat self-reflective album for Seefeel. For example, the track Ever No Way samples an interpolation of Plain Song, which is like a standout classic from Seefeel's debut, 1993's Kick or Quick. I never know how to pronounce that. And in his 8.1 review for Pitchfork, Philip Sherburne wrote, "Between the warmth of Peacock's singing and the full spectrum embrace of Clifford's treated guitars, it sometimes feels like Seefeel are finally closing the gap between their long-standing atmospheric sensibilities and the more pointed melodic thrust of Kick." Adding that it sounds like they're, quote, taking shoegaze to its logical conclusion and documenting its last mournful gasp. Lastly, this being an Autechre podcast, we'd be remiss not to shout out Autechre's iconic remix of Seefeel's Spangle, released on the 1994 Stare Through EP, but also included on Warp's Artificial Intelligence 2 compilation. Seefeel also remixed Bass Cadet, you'll remember. When asked why they chose that track, Clifford replied, "I'm not sure it was our choice. I think Sean just asked me to do Bass Cadet. If they asked me again, I'd almost certainly say yes. I have so much respect for them both musically and as people." Also, Autechre was mentioned in that Wire cover story I keep referencing in relation to some pretty interesting IDM lore. Apparently, Autechre and Seefeel would argue about whether the first track on Aphex Twin's Selected Ambient Works 2 sampled Peacock's voice, which RDJ would refuse to confirm, and Peacock says that she's since come around to agreeing with the guys from AE that it really is her.
Hot off the press, Seefeel did an AMA on the kiosk forums this past weekend, so we wanted to mention a few interesting comments. We linked the whole thing in the show notes of the episode. But first, in regard to the 110 version of the same track thing, Mark Clifford had this to say, quote, "The tracks on Everything Squared/Square Roots pretty much all started from one point, one track, We Angle 1, from which parts were plundered, new track created, new parts added, then parts plundered again, new track created, and so on. So all the tracks on those releases exist within one folder and were variously called We Angle 44, We Angle 65, etc., before being given alternate titles. It actually became increasingly confusing for anyone but myself to know which track I was even referring to at any given time if talking to Sarah or someone else. It was quite an interesting process and allowed themes to exist and to reoccur from track to track. Sol.Hz was different in that tracks were written more as individual entities, though the final version might be a long way from the original in a couple of instances, Everdays and Humidity Switch. They were refined, yes, particularly rhythmically. The musical element is usually very instinctive and will remain largely unchanged, but the rhythmic parts and the bed of each track is normally the part I agonize more over, particularly at the mixing stage, and there are often many minute revisions, changes that are maybe not particularly noticeable to anyone but myself."
Clifford also reflected back on the 90s IDM scene, saying, "There was a period when I saw a lot of Richard D. James, Sean and Rob of Autechre, amongst others, yes. I even remember a Reflex / Seefeel baseball match on Blackheath Common, I'm sure I'm mispronouncing that. And that was largely the nature of things, really, very much social. We didn't spend much time discussing technique or gear, though of course these things came up occasionally. As far as the scene that existed goes, I suppose it was quite a random affair in the sense that everyone was doing their own thing. We weren't all working within the same space or as part of a solidified scene. I was obviously influenced by Richard and AE, as I was by much of the music around me at the time. It was inevitable. How much reciprocation there was is not really for me to say. In terms of what we added to the mix, well, again, as much as you gave me the scope to brag," he's like responding to one of the commenters on that AMA, "I really can't say because that's very objective. I guess one thing we maybe did was to expand the idea that electronic music doesn't have to be intrinsically linked to synthesizers." I know he technically described that baseball game as being like a reflex thing, but I like imagining Autechre, Aphex Twin, and Seefeel playing baseball. That's quite a picture. So, having gotten all that out there, I think there was just happened to be a lot of interesting background because there's been so much like kind of press and excitement sort of about this record. What is your relationship, Dan, to Seefeel? I'm not sure I even know. And how do you feel about this record?
My relationship to him, it's never anyone I've gotten super into. I know the big ones, Kick and Sucker, but that's about it. I'm not like a giant fan or anything.
Yeah, I would consider myself kind of a new fan, although I do love them a lot. Actually, it was I think 2021 they put out this compilation that I think it was called like Rupt and Flex or something, and it collected and actually expanded a little bit two of their weirdest albums, that Sucker album and then the one that came after, which is called like CH Vox. Really abstract, like bordering on dark ambient sometimes, but I really got into that, and from there branched, backwards into, Kick and forward. I got really into those 2024 kind of mini albums / EPs. Really like them a lot. So I was really looking forward to this. Like I said, it's really getting high praises. How did you feel about it spending a week with it, Dan?
Well, I enjoy it. I don't love it or anything. In fact, I started listening to it when it first came out because I didn't know we were going to do this episode. Mm-hmm. So I've actually kind of spent, I think, more time with it than I think I normally would have. So I think maybe part of it is I've burned myself out on it quite a bit. But I think it's okay.
Yeah, I mean, I can understand that. It's a weird record. It's it's very vague, I think. In a way, I mean, the Pitchfork review makes a lot out of this, but it is kind of an interesting combo, if you are a longtime Seefeel fan, of some of their most abstract stuff and also their kind of earlier shoegazy stuff. It sort of combines those two sounds, which is like fun to hear, but results in something really kind of that feels very vague and abstract. I mean, honestly, I was going back to some of their earlier records this past week, and like even something as weird as Sucker sounds positively catchy, I think, compared to this record, which is kind of just like this hazy floating thing. I mean, my feeling about it is that I find it kind of a fascinating record. I think I'm in that zone, sometimes where it's like, it's more interesting to me to think about than fun to actually listen to. Although I will say that I have felt that way about other Seefeel records and kind of like they grew on me. So I could totally see that happening. I'll be curious, if like maybe by the end of the year, it's just kind of hung around, but you kind of with me on that?
Yeah, I get you. It's vague and whatnot is a good way to put it. It's the kind of record where the first few times I listened to it, I have that feeling of like that was good, but I sort of instantly don't remember anything about it, kind of thing. It like took a while, I think, to show itself to me.
Yeah, I mean, it's like very, it's kind of like cloudy or hazy or like a mist, it just sort of like hangs there and then it sort of dissipates and it almost like immediately leaves your mind or something, but it feels very intentional to me. I mean, that's one of the things that I find really interesting about it is that I noticed when I was like listening this week and just like I've been kind of listening to it a lot since it came out, so I've probably spent more time with it than even normally when we do these bonus episodes, but it's like when you have it, you put it on and there's something really vague about it where you're like, you feel like you're not hearing everything or like it's not in focus. So then you crank the volume, but then the bass is so like subterranean that it kind of like swallows everything. And so you turn it back down, but then it's too quiet. And it's like, it's this thing that like, it feels like you can't quite hear it no matter what volume it's at, or like an object that is blurry no matter what distance you are from it. Like an impressionist painting or something, maybe?
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. In fact, like today when I was listening like the last time and finishing up notes and everything, like I had it playing on my stereo system, and I felt that same way. I was like riding the remote, it was like, it's too quiet. And then it would, the bass whatever would piss my dogs off, and I have to turn it back down. It really is like it's like a movie nowadays. You gotta ride the remote the whole time.
And the first track like really screws with you because it fades in like so slowly, and it actually gets like really loud. I mean, honestly, even compared to like the track that follows or whatever. So I always found that I would kind of put it on, I can't hear anything, I like kind of crank it, and then by the time that like mid swell happens, it's like blaring, I'm like, holy shit, like I'm trying to turn it down, as fast as I can.
The other trick it does in there too is like that first track, how it ends with the like kind of feedback, like sort of spiraling out, but quietly. And so you think like, oh, it's done. And then the next track, it's like, just kidding. Here's a very high pitched, feedback squeal right into your...
And there's like a lot of weird, kind of gaps of just silence a lot of times, like between tracks that makes you think it's over or something. I mean, the Pitchfork review makes a lot of this, which is that it spends like most of its running time fading in or fading out, like coming or going, which is really strange. Like, I just don't think I've ever quite heard a record like this. And, I want to clarify that I kind of think, and I don't consider myself any kind of like Seefeel expert. Like I said, I consider myself kind of a newish fan just in the last couple of years, and I haven't listened to everything, but I think of this as maybe being like kind of a Seefeel quality in general, but it just feels like more pronounced here than ever before, maybe. That kind of vagueness, that haziness. And, you might say that kind of like blurry at any distance quality is core to shoegaze or dream pop, which is like their whole thing. But again, it just feels like it's being emphasized in a certain way. The other thing I think is being emphasized in a really interesting way is, that practice he has of working through versions. It's funny to think about, we just did like a whole series on Autechre's chorustis kind of era, which is that versions mentality, but this is like that to the max, like 110 different versions of a thing. And him talking about, of course that was on the previous records, but on this record even, it's like some tracks ending up quite a long ways from where they ever started. I mean, I feel like I really hear that. Like, you feel like you are hearing something that is many iterations away. Like, that kind of adds to that feeling of distance from you. Like it sounds like the echo of a track rather than a track itself, or like, you know, the impression that would be left on a mattress rather than any substance, you know, that used to be there or something. It's another one of those things that I find very, very fascinating, like intellectually, but is kind of a, you know, maybe frustrating listening experience.
Yeah, totally. I totally agree with you. You know, the way you put it, it's great. You know, like you said, like that mattress impression. It's you always have that, and it is like intellectually and and like artistically like a fun thing to talk about and everything. But yeah, I mean, it just oftentimes listening to this record, I mean, you talk about like how in between the tracks there's always like, you know, these fade outs that go so low that like even sometimes with headphones I would be like, oh, did I disconnect? Is the record over? You know, and in fact, like many times when the record was over, I thought it was still, you know, one of those, you know, kind of fade out things and stuff. And it just sort of always like, I don't know, it just like never fully like felt like I was in the record, you know?
I know, and I really feel like that is totally intentional, and I've never quite heard anything like that, and I really appreciate that on an intellectual level, but it's a weird listening experience because yeah, I think that the overall, like that quality of the tracks that feel like they're always either coming or going, or like they leave too early. I mean, I swear to God, there would be a track that's only like 4 minutes long, and a full minute and a half early, it basically finishes, and you just hear like the quietest kind of, that seems to be kind of roughly replicated by the overall structure of the record as a whole. I think it's really weird that like the first two tracks, I think, are like the least musical here. I mean, yeah, like horrible choice for opening tracks, honestly. And then the last track is such a like almost nothing, like kind of question mark. I mean, we'll talk about it obviously, but in that sense, it feels like this record that kind of works like one of the tracks does, where it takes a while to kind of like come into being. And then just as it kind of like finds its footing, it starts to kind of disappear. And it just like, you know, wisps away like a cloud or something. And it's almost like it was never even there. I feel like it's like a record that's trying to make as little impression as possible. And in that respect, it's like, you know what I mean? It's like, I feel like that's kind of fresh, like kind of interesting.
Yeah, I mean, it's certainly like an interesting idea and like intellectually interesting, like we keep saying. But yeah, I don't know. I've listened to it so much now at this point. I mean, like we said, like more than I normally would, you know, for these bonus episodes and stuff. And I just like still sort of feel like I don't I don't really have like a full grasp on the album or anything, or even like I've heard it, you know?
Yeah, because it's like insubstantial. It's like you'll never get a hold of it, you know?
It's almost like, you know, when a song's like got a low pass filter on it or something, and it sounds like you're listening through a door. It's the record is almost like, you know, like you can never like actually be listening to it where you are, you know, if that makes any sense.
Right. No, totally. And it honestly makes me think of like the, you know, Brian Eno's original inspiration for ambient, right? It was that he was in a hospital room and there was classical music playing, but they had left it on like so quiet that you just couldn't even really hear it. And he got kind of fascinated by this, like, I can't hear it, but it's like it's there, you know? And that was kind of the invention of ambient music. I feel like this is like, we're going back to the OG ambient music, which is like, you almost just can't even get a hold of it. Like it's never close enough or something.
Yeah. I liked what the Phil Sherburne said. Like, I mean, it does seem like the kind of logical conclusion of shoegaze. You know, it's taking like that ethereal, you know, sort of quality, like to the absolute extreme, which, you know, again, as an idea is great. Not so sure I like listening to it.
No, it's interesting too, because you've reminded me of like, there's a comment, I can't remember even which song, but Brian Eno said something about My Bloody Valentine, where he said it's the vaguest track to ever be a hit, you know? So there are these like connections going on. But yeah, and I think the other thing, which of course we'll talk about, is like just how skeletal the drums are on this, I think adds to that kind of like insubstantial quality. You know, the way he plays bass, we mentioned it in kind of this like background thing. It's never like full dubby, like it never kind of fills. It always is very staccato, like very stabby. And it almost sounds like, sometimes it's hard to tell, like, is that a kick or is that a bass? Because they're almost being played in like the same way.
Yeah.
And it just makes for this very kind of like it's just these little bumps. It's so weird because I was reading that Wire cover story, which is really interesting. I would link it, but I feel like that's wrong. I want to support the Wire, so you should just subscribe. But they had mentioned like, okay, when we first started, we made this rule, which is like keep the drums really simple, no toms, no cymbals, like that kind of thing. They've gone even farther, right? Which is like there's just kick basically.
Yeah. I think like the most drums there, physical drums there ever are on a track is like 2 different pieces.
Yeah, right. And actually I think it's kind of interesting because I think it's the track Until Now that is the most drummy, and that's like right as the record, so again, it has that quality of like it's finally kind of getting some momentum and then it just sort of disappears, just vanishes, like because that's like the penultimate track. But yeah, it adds to that quality, especially the way that the bass never kind of fills the track. You just feel like it's never gotten started or it's never like totally come together or something. And yeah, so I mean, really, really interesting. I guess, the only other thing I wanted to talk about up front is just, it is interesting that this is kind of a self-reflective record. I think usually that sucks, that usually is like a bad sign when somebody's like, oh, this is their record of like, they're kind of going back to basics or thinking about how they got started or whatever. But as you kind of touched on, it feels like you're listening to early Seefeel like through a filter or something. So it's kind of like self-aware in that like way. But it is interesting how it got me kind of just reflecting on, there's something really funny has happened to Seefeel, which is like they used to be outsiders in IDM because they played guitar and stuff like that. And now they're like elder statesmen, right alongside Aphex Twin and Autechre, reminiscing about old baseball games and stuff. But it is funny that like, it was actually controversial. They talked about this a little bit in that Wire story. Like there was some controversy where like the hardcore warp heads were pissed like that they signed a guitar band and stuff. And, so the old question, like, is this electronic or is it rock? It's kind of stupid, but it is interesting to like kind of think back on how far we've come, because remember we've talked a lot about this, like just casually about there used to be these hardcore divisions that just no longer exist anymore. In a way, Seefeel are one of those people that like help break those walls down.
Mm-hmm, totally.
And I was also thinking, we also talked, I forget when, but we were talking about like the kind of interesting crossover between like the worlds of electronic and post-rock in the 90s, which I think Autechre were like in almost like an overlooked way kind of part of. Seefeel is obviously like key to that kind of connection, right?
Yeah, definitely.
All right, well, before we get into the tracks, let me just get some of the listeners on the table. Not a lot of write-ins for this very vague, very strange album, even though it won that kind of, neck and neck race to pick our next bonus episode topic. But we'll get the listeners on the table with the high-level thoughts. Ian had this to say: some albums allow you to hear who is making them. Instruments, sounds, and ideas repeat, and we begin to identify the contributors. Not here. There are guitars all over the album, but at no point are they plucked, strummed, or played in a conventional way. Drums thump and thud, but again, you can't imagine a stick or mallet being used. After listening to the album a few times this week in different circumstances, I concluded that it's one that needs attention. Listen closely and you are rewarded with a complex, detailed, involving journey. Have it on in the car or while you're busy, and it drifts by almost unnoticed.
Rob says, I really liked Seefeel's kick with the way it captured the shoegaze, emo, ambient vibe of the 90s. There's something optimistic about that record that makes me misty-eyed for the early 90s. Sol.Hz is a different beast. It reminds me of the outros and intermissions of BOC's Tomorrow's Harvest, and is so ambient as to barely be considered music in a traditional sense in some of the tracks. That's not to say that I don't like it. It's definitely a headphones album, as on my speakers, it too often fades into a background vibe and the effort of the production is lost. Close listening reveals a moody, brooding, atmospheric album that then builds toward something more euphoric.
And then listener Joe said, I've listened to Sol.Hz over and over the last week or two, and although it sounds perfectly nice, I don't think I get the hype. It seems like the kind of album that 10 to 15 years from now, you might vaguely remember an artist releasing, but not really remembering anything about it in particular. Anytime I put it on when I was driving, it's so funny that the first listener had said, don't put it on while you're driving. With my daughters, they'd almost immediately start dozing off, which is what would happen to me, aside from the fact that I was driving. Although I don't have anything to contribute this week, I look forward to hearing from you guys and other gonkers to find out what I've been missing. I mean, definitely there's like kind of mixed thoughts, I think, overall. And everybody's kind of commenting on that weird, like, ungraspable quality of like, you never, you feel like you got to really listen close, but even then it's like, you never kind of find something to hold on to. But with that, should we get into the track by track?
Let's do it.
If you'd like to hear the rest of the conversation, head on over to patreon.com/GONKCAST, where $5 a month gets you this and all of our bonus episodes.